Steel scraped against marble. It was a pathetic sound. Surrounded by towering armored brutes, the lone diplomat drew a 6-inch blade. High above, Princess Chloe laughed, a bright musical sound that echoed across the execution chamber. Humans were obsolete, fragile things. They relied on big guns and orbital strikes. Stripped of his rifle, he was just soft flesh holding a butter knife. 10 seconds later, her laughter stopped. The screaming started. Humanity didn't need lasers to be lethal. The grand audience hall of the Sovereign Coalition was designed to make a man feel small. It succeeded. Vaulted ceilings stretched 100 feet upward, held aloft by pillars of seamless polished obsidian. Banners of spun gold and deep crimson hung from the rafters, absorbing the harsh, sterile light pouring in from the orbital mirrors outside. It was a room built for gods, or at least beings who believed they were gods. Cole Adams stood in the dead center of the floor. He didn't look like a god. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 72 hours, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that was currently torn at the left shoulder. He was bleeding from a shallow cut above his eyebrow. The blood dripped slow and steady, stinging his eye. He didn't wipe it away. Movement in this room was a privilege, and right now, the Coalition had revoked it. Behind him, Ambassador Hayes was on his knees. The older man was breathing heavily, clutching his ribs where a Coalition guard had casually backhanded him 5 minutes prior. The diplomatic mission was over. The peace talks were a farce, a beautifully orchestrated trap meant to lure the Terran delegation into the heart of the Coalition's capital ship and decapitate human leadership in one swift stroke. Surrounding them were the Praetorians. 12 of them. They were massive, bipedal, but built like armored freight trains, standing 8 feet tall in their powered exoskeletons. Their armor was a blinding, pristine white humming with the low, nauseating frequency of active energy shielding. Each guard held a heavy plasma halberd. The weapons crackled with contained stellar heat, casting harsh blue shadows across the marble floor. High above the execution circle, safely behind a wall of transparent kinetic dampening glass, sat Princess Chloe. She reclined on a throne of sculpted polymer, sipping a clear, luminescent liquid from a crystal flute. She wore the elegant flowing silks of the sovereign elite. Her posture relaxed her expression, a mask of bored amusement. Her species, though humanoid enough to adopt Terran names for diplomatic ease, possessed an innate arrogance that transcended biology. They had ruled this sector for 1,000 years. They had conquered through superior technology, orbital bombardment, and economic strangulation. They fought wars from control rooms. They didn't bleed. They didn't sweat. Ambassador Hayes. Chloe's voice floated down from hidden acoustic emitters, smooth and dripping with condescension. You must understand my position. Humanity is a loud, grating anomaly in a perfectly ordered galaxy. You expand too fast. You consume too much. This execution isn't personal. It is merely housekeeping. Hayes coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the pristine floor. You're declaring war on Terra. You think breaking diplomatic immunity won't have consequences. Consequences. Chloe laughed. It was a light, airy sound. Who will know a tragic reactor malfunction, a rogue pirate ambush on your return journey? We write the official reports, Ambassador. As for your military, they are crude. Effective perhaps when hiding behind their dreadnoughts and mass drivers. But here, in the flesh. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Cole. The bodyguard had remained entirely silent. Cole's heavy pulse rifle lay in pieces 20 feet away, dismantled by the magnetic security fields at the hall's entrance. His sidearm was gone. His ceramic knuckle dusters had been confiscated. They had stripped him down to the lint in his pockets. Or so they thought. Cole rolled his shoulders. The joints popped loud in the cavernous silence. He reached down to his right boot. The guard shifted heavy armor, grinding halberds dipping a fraction of an inch. They were slow. Massive, powerful, protected by layers of kinetic barriers, but slow. They relied on the armor to do the thinking. His hand found the familiar leather sheath concealed beneath the hem of his trousers. He wrapped his fingers around the handle. Checkered grip, carbon steel alloy, 6 inches of matte black metal forged in a factory in Ohio, sharpened on a whetstone during long, boring hyperspace jumps. He pulled it free. The scrape of the metal against the scabbard was impossibly loud. Cole held the knife loosely by his side. It caught no light. It hummed with no energy. It was just a sharpened wedge of metal, a tool older than recorded history. Up in the gallery, Princess Chloe stared. Then she smiled. The smile widened into a genuine musical laugh. "A blade!" she gasped, covering her mouth in mock shock. "A piece of sharpened metal, oh you Terrans! You truly are feral. You bring a dining utensil to fight Praetorians in active power armor." The 12 guards rumbled with synthesized amusement. Their shields flared, interlocking in a shimmering wall of blue energy. A plasma halberd could melt a tank hull. A kinetic shield could stop a hypersonic railgun slug. Cole didn't look up at the princess. He didn't look at the shields. He looked at the floor. He noted the polished marble. Slippery. He looked at the Praetorian stances. Wide. Planted. Relying on the shields to absorb impact rather than moving to avoid it. They trusted the math of their armor. Math doesn't account for desperation. Math doesn't bleed. "Stay down, sir," Cole muttered to Hayes. His voice was gravelly, devoid of inflection. Hayes rasped panic, finally bleeding into his tone. "They have active shields. You can't—" "Shields are calibrated for high-velocity impacts," Cole said. He shifted his grip, placing his thumb flat against the spine of the blade. "Bullet speeds, laser thermal blooms, they harden on sudden massive kinetic transfer." Cole looked up, his eyes cold and dead as winter ice locked onto the nearest guard. "They don't trigger for slow objects." The Praetorian moved first. He stepped forward a mountain of white armor, raising the plasma halberd for a sweeping execution strike. He didn't bother to guard his center mass. Why would he? He was a god stepping on an ant. Cole moved, not backward away from the heat of the blade. Forward, inside the guard's reach. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, dropping his center of gravity. The halberd sheared the air above his head, the backwash of plasma searing the tips of Cole's hair, filling his nose with the stench of burned ozone. The guard's shield was a visible blue bubble shimmering 2 inches off the white armor. Cole didn't strike. He pressed. He lunged into the guard's chest, driving his left shoulder hard into the armor to brace himself, and slid the combat knife forward. Deliberately, smoothly, below the threshold of the shield's velocity sensors. The blue energy rippled but didn't solidify. The matte black blade slipped right through the kinetic barrier. Cole didn't aim for the armor plating. He aimed for the joint beneath the armpit, where the heavy chest plate met the bicep guard. A flexible rubber mesh gasket meant to keep the suit pressurized. The blade sank to the hilt. The Praetorian froze. A wet mechanized gurgle escaped its helmet vocoder. Cole twisted the blade 90 degrees, widening the wound channel, severing the brachial artery and the primary nerve cluster in one vicious motion. He yanked the knife free and pivoted smoothly as the 8-foot giant collapsed, a fountain of dark violet blood spraying across the pristine white armor and the marble floor. 1 down, 11 left. The room erupted. The silence shattered into a chaotic din of warning klaxons and roaring aliens. The remaining 11 Praetorians broke formation. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sudden violent urgency. Cole was already moving. He couldn't afford to stop. The moment he stopped, the sheer volume of plasma in the room would turn him to ash. He didn't fight like a duelist. He fought like a street brawler who happened to possess a master's degree in human anatomy and a profound lack of self-preservation. 2 guards charged from his right. Cole sprinted to the left, using the falling body of the first guard as cover. A blast of plasma chewed into the marble, where he had just been sending red-hot shrapnel flying. Cole slid on the slick, blood-spattered floor, passing beneath the sweeping arc of a halberd. As he slid, he reached up, finding the soft gap behind the second guard's knee joint. He dragged the blade across the mesh. Tendons snapped like steel cables. The guard buckled with a roar, the suit's gyros failing to compensate for the sudden loss of structural support. As the alien fell forward, Cole rolled to his feet, grabbed the back of the alien's helmet, and jammed the knife straight down into the cervical gap at the base of the skull. The guard hit the floor dead. Cole ripped the blade out. 2. He didn't think. Thought required time. He let muscle memory and adrenaline take the wheel. The world narrowed to a tunnel of blue shields, white armor, and the desperate burning demand for oxygen in his lungs. A third guard managed to bash him with the haft of a weapon. The blow caught Cole in the ribs. He felt the bone crack, a sharp white-hot spike of agony that stole his breath. He was thrown backward, crashing hard against one of the obsidian pillars. "Kill him!" Chloe's voice screamed from the speakers. The musical amusement was entirely gone. It was replaced by a shrill, cracking panic. "Burn him!" 4 guards converged on the pillar. They lowered their weapons, preparing to unleash a sustained thermal barrage. Cole pushed off the pillar, fighting through the blinding pain in his chest. He grabbed the heavy plasma halberd, dropped by the second dead guard. He didn't try to swing it. It weighed 80 pounds, entirely too heavy for a baseline human to wield effectively. Instead, he thumbed the weapon's overload sequence, a simple toggle near the grip, and hurled it like a spear into the center of the converging guards. He dove behind the obsidian pillar, just as the weapon's containment field failed. The explosion was deafening. A concussive wave of superheated air and blinding blue light ripped through the hall. The kinetic shields of the 4 guards flared brilliantly as they absorbed the blast, but the sheer force threw them off their feet, tossing 3-ton armored suits across the room like discarded toys. Cole didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He stepped out from behind the pillar, coughing through the thick ozone-heavy haze. The remaining 5 guards were disoriented, their helmet sensors blinded by the localized EMP of the plasma detonation. Cole moved like a ghost through the smoke. He grabbed one guard from behind, reaching around the massive chest to drive the knife into the throat seal. He used the dying guard as a meat shield as another fired wildly into the smoke, the plasma bolts melting the armor of his comrade. Cole dropped the corpse and sprinted through the gap, closing the distance before the shooter could adjust his aim. A feint to the head. The guard raised his arm. Cole sank the knife into the exposed femoral artery at the hip. The alien screamed, dropping the weapon to clutch the spurting wound. Cole stepped on the alien's knee, vaulted upward, and drove his heel into the front of the helmet. The kinetic shield flared, but the sheer weight of Cole's momentum snapped the alien's neck backward. 3 left. They backed away. The apex predators of the coalition men who had crushed rebellions and burned cities were backing away from a bleeding, exhausted human in a ruined suit. They raised their weapons, their hands shaking. They finally understood. The Terran wasn't fighting them. He was butchering them. He didn't care about honor or formation or the grand theater of combat. He was a cornered animal, and his only objective was to make sure nothing else in the room was breathing. Cole spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. He wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing the crimson across his cheek. He tightened his grip on the knife. His arm was shaking from adrenaline fatigue. His ribs felt like broken glass inside his chest. He looked at the 3 remaining guards. He gave them no quarter. He offered no surrender. He charged. The final guard fell against the base of the observation glass. He didn't die quietly. He clawed at the polished marble, a low gurgling wheeze rattling from his helmet vocoder as violet blood pooled rapidly beneath him. Cole stood over the dying giant. His chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. His charcoal suit was unrecognizable, saturated with dark alien blood, scored by plasma burns and torn to rags. He stared down at the guard, his face an empty, terrifying mask. He raised his right hand. The 6-inch blade was chipped. The matte black finish was gone, stained wet, and gleaming in the harsh overhead light. With a brutal mechanical efficiency, Cole drove the knife down one last time. The wheezing stopped. The great audience hall of the Sovereign Coalition fell perfectly deathly silent. The warning klaxons had been disabled by the chaotic plasma fire. The humming of the active energy shields was gone. There was only the wet, heavy sound of blood dripping from the edge of a Terran blade, hitting the floor in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Drip, drip, drip. Cole didn't celebrate. He didn't scream a battle cry. He slowly pulled his shoulders back, wincing as the cracked ribs shifted, and turned his gaze upward. Behind the kinetic dampening glass, Princess Chloe was frozen. She had dropped her crystal flute. It lay shattered on the floor of her gallery, the luminescent liquid seeping into the plush carpets. She stood pressed against the back wall of her viewing box, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. She looked at the floor. 12 Praetorians. 12 unstoppable engines of war encased in the finest technology the Coalition could manufacture. Slaughtered. By a piece of sharpened steel and a man who looked like he belonged behind a desk. For the first time in her long, privileged life, the Princess of the Sovereign Coalition truly understood what humanity was. The galaxy saw them as crude mechanics, a species that solved problems with big engines and bigger guns. But the guns weren't what made them dangerous. The technology was just a cage they built to keep themselves civilized. When the cage was stripped away, what remained wasn't a fragile scholar. What remained was an apex predator, born on a high-gravity death world, forged in millennia of brutal, intimate violence. Cole stared up at her through the glass. He didn't point the knife. He didn't make a threat. He just looked at her, his eyes devoid of anything resembling mercy or fear. The look promised one simple truth: glass breaks. Chloe collapsed back into her throne, her legs giving out. She couldn't look away from him. She couldn't breathe. Cole held her gaze for 3 long seconds, ensuring the memory was permanently burned into her royal psyche. Then he turned away. He walked slowly back to the center of the room. Ambassador Hayes was still on his knees, staring in numb shock at the carnage surrounding him. The older man was trembling, his eyes tracking the trails of violet blood that painted the pristine marble. Cole stopped in front of the ambassador. He reached down with his left hand, the one not holding the bloody knife, and grabbed the older man by the shoulder. "Get up, sir," Cole said. His voice was quiet, steady, entirely unaffected by the butchery he had just committed. Hayes swallowed hard, nodding mutely. He allowed Cole to haul him to his feet. The ambassador swayed slightly, leaning on Cole for support. Are we leaving?" Hayes managed to stammer, looking warily at the massive reinforced doors at the far end of the hall. Cole knelt, wiping the blade of his knife clean on the white fabric of a fallen guard's cape. He slid the weapon back into the sheath, hidden in his boot. He stood up, adjusting his torn, bloody suit jacket with a grim finality. "Yes, sir," Cole said, scanning the exit. Negotiations are concluded. The heavy obsidian doors at the far end of the audience hall remained sealed. A solid block of reinforced durasteel designed to keep assassins out, or in this case, to keep the victims in. Cole let go of Ambassador Hayes for a moment, leaving the older man to lean heavily against a decorative pillar. Cole walked back to the nearest dead Praetorian. The alien's blood was already beginning to coagulate, a thick violet sludge pooling on the marble. Cole knelt, ignoring the spike of agony from his cracked ribs, and began digging through the gaps in the massive white armor. He didn't want the halberd. It was heavy, unwieldy, and screamed his position to every sensor on the ship. He needed something practical. His fingers found a heavy clasp on the guard's thigh plate. He wrenched it open. A sidearm. It was blocky, heavy, and lacked a traditional trigger guard built for the oversized armored digits of a Praetorian. Cole pulled it free. It weighed a solid 6 pounds, practically a heavy rifle by Terran standards. He checked the power cell. A glowing green indicator near the grip confirmed it was fully charged. He tucked the pistol into the waistband of his ruined trousers. Next, he found a communications relay clipped to the guard's collar. He ripped it loose, wiping the blood off on his sleeve, and crushed it under the heel of his boot. He did the same to the next 3 bodies. Blind them. Deafen them. Make the ship's command center guess what was happening in the room. "Cole," Hayes whispered. The ambassador's voice was a frail, reedy thing in the massive, quiet room. "The doors, they're magnetic locks, triple redundancy. We can't open them." "I know," Cole said. He walked toward the heavy doors. He didn't slow down. "That's why I'm not going to try." He stopped 10 feet from the durasteel barrier. He looked at the wall to the right of the doors. It was paneled in a beautiful synthetic mahogany, lined with glowing artistic engravings of the Coalition's historic victories. To an alien, it was a monument to their enduring power. To Cole, it was a hollow facade covering essential ship infrastructure. He drew the heavy plasma sidearm. He gripped it with both hands, bracing his stance, and aimed at the mahogany paneling. "Cover your ears, sir," Cole ordered. He didn't wait for Hayes to comply. He pulled the firing stud. The recoil was a mule kick, jarring his broken ribs so hard his vision briefly flashed white. A bolt of concentrated superheated plasma the size of a grapefruit erupted from the barrel. It slammed into the decorative wall. The mahogany vanished in a flash of blinding thermal energy, instantly vaporized. The durasteel bulkhead behind it groaned under the intense heat, melting outward like warm wax. Cole fired twice more systematically, carving a jagged, glowing hole through the structural housing beside the main door frame. The smell of burning polymer and melted wire flooded the air, sharp and toxic. He stepped back, breathing heavily, and holstered the oversized weapon. Through the molten smoking hole, he could see the sterile, brightly lit corridor beyond. The ship's internal security network had routed power through this junction. Now, thick cables sputtered and sparked, severed by the blasts. The magnetic locks on the grand doors disengaged with a heavy, hollow thud. Unpowered, they were just heavy pieces of metal on ball bearings. Cole walked to the seam of the doors. He jammed his fingers into the microscopic gap, planted his boots on the slick marble, and pulled. His muscles screamed. The veins in his neck bulged, straining against the immense friction of the unpowered blast doors. Slowly, agonizingly, the left door ground open on its track, yielding just enough space for a man to slip through. Cole stepped back, panting a thin sheen of cold sweat mixing with the dried blood on his face. He gestured to the gap. "After you, Ambassador." Hayes stared at the smoking wall, then at the forced door, then at his bodyguard. He realized with a cold knot forming in his stomach that he didn't know the man standing in front of him. He knew the resume. Cole Adams, ex-Marine, diplomatic security. Quiet, efficient, mostly stood in the background, looking intimidating in a tailored suit. He didn't know this predator breathing heavy in a ruined, blood-soaked shirt. Hayes didn't argue. He squeezed through the gap into the corridor. Cole followed his eyes, constantly scanning the stolen sidearm back in his right hand. The corridor was empty. The pristine white walls and gleaming floors stretched in both directions, curving slightly, to follow the massive circumference of the capital ship. Overhead, the sterile white lighting flickered, transitioning to a harsh, pulsing amber. The ship's internal alert system. They had maybe 3 minutes before the regular military forces arrived. The Praetorians were dead, but this ship housed a garrison of 10,000 coalition auxiliaries. "Where to?" Hayes asked, his voice shaking. "Our shuttle is in Hangar 4. That's 10 decks down and 2 kilometers aft." "They know that," Cole said flatly. He wiped a drop of sweat from his eye. "The hangar is a kill zone by now. They'll have snipers on the gantries and heavy armor locking down the flight deck. Then we're dead." "No." Cole looked down the curving corridor. "They expect us to run for the exit. That's what cornered prey does. We aren't prey." "What are we doing, Cole?" "We're going to the primary reactor control." Cole said, his voice dead of all emotion. It's 3 decks down center mass, heavily shielded, hard to breach. Hayes stared at him aghast. "You want to capture the ship's reactor? I want to threaten to blow it up," Cole corrected. "Princess Chloe wants to play games with our lives. Let's see how she plays when we put a gun to the heart of her flagship." The pulse of the amber alert lights gave the corridor a sickly rhythmic heartbeat. Cole moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He didn't run. Running wasted oxygen. He stalked. He checked corners before he crossed them, sweeping the oversized plasma pistol in smooth, controlled arcs. Hayes trailed behind him, a frightened shadow, struggling to keep his dress shoes from clicking too loudly on the metal deck. They reached the first security checkpoint, leading to the central transit lifts. 4 coalition auxiliaries manned the barricade. They were a different breed from the Praetorians. Shorter, leaner, wearing standard-issue gray carapace armor rather than powered exoskeletons. They carried rapid-fire kinetic carbines. They were currently looking the wrong way, their weapons aimed nervously down the main thoroughfare, expecting an army of Terrans to come pouring out of the audience hall. They didn't expect one battered man in a torn suit emerging from a maintenance access corridor behind them. Cole didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a warning. He raised the Praetorian pistol and fired. The first auxiliary took a plasma bolt center mass. His kinetic shield flared briefly, trying to absorb the impact, but the Praetorian weapon was designed to pierce heavy vehicle armor. The shield shattered like glass. The auxiliary was thrown violently against the bulkhead. His chest plate melted down to the bone. The sound of the blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The remaining 3 guards spun around, panic registering in their wide alien eyes. Cole was already moving. He tossed the heavy pistol to his left hand, drew the bloody combat knife from his boot with his right, and charged. The auxiliaries opened fire. A hail of tungsten-tipped kinetic rounds shredded the air where Cole had been a half-second before. He threw himself into a brutal sliding tackle, passing beneath the line of fire. He crashed into the shins of the nearest guard, taking the alien's legs out from under him. As the guard fell, Cole drove the knife upward, burying it in the unarmored seam beneath the alien's chin. He twisted the blade, yanked it free, and used the falling body as a shield. Thud, thud, thud. 3 kinetic rounds slammed into the dead guard's carapace armor, inches from Cole's face. Cole didn't flinch. He leveled the heavy plasma pistol from behind his meat shield and fired twice. Blind, calculating the angles based on where the muzzle flashes had originated, a heavy wet thump followed by a gargling scream told him he'd hit the mark. He shoved the corpse aside and rolled into a crouch. The 3rd guard lay on the deck, clutching a ruined leg, his carbine clattering away. The 4th guard stared at Cole, his weapon trembling. The alien looked at his 3 dead and dying comrades, then at the Terran. Cole was covered in violet blood, his face a grim bruised canvas, his eyes burning with a cold mechanical focus. The guard dropped his rifle. He held up his 4-fingered hands in a universal gesture of surrender. He babbled something in his native tongue, his voice cracking with terror. Cole stood up. He walked over to the terrified alien. He looked at the dropped rifle. He looked at the alien's face. Cole shot him in the chest. Hayes let out a muffled gasp from the corridor behind them. Cole didn't look back. He holstered the pistol bent down and picked up one of the dropped kinetic carbines. He checked the magazine, slammed it back into place, and slung the weapon over his shoulder. He surrendered, Hayes stammered, finally stepping out from the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the smoking hole in the 4th guard's chest. "We don't have zip ties, sir," Cole said, checking the pockets of the dead guards for spare magazines. "We don't have a brig. We leave him alive. He gets on a comms terminal the second we're out of sight and tells command exactly where we are. But the rules of engagement died in that audience hall." Cole interrupted his voice, finally carrying a sharp edge. He turned to look at the ambassador. "They broke diplomatic immunity. They murdered our honor guard at the airlock. They were going to live stream your execution to the sector. There are no rules anymore, Ambassador. There is only survival, and I am going to make sure you survive. Am I understood?" Hayes swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He looked at Cole's dead flat eyes. He nodded. "Understood. Good." Cole grabbed a security keycard from the belt of the squad leader and swiped it at the transit lift console. The heavy doors chimed and slid open. "Get in," Cole said. They stepped into the spacious glass and steel elevator. Cole hit the button for deck 14, 3 levels below. As the doors sealed and the lift began its rapid descent, the adrenaline suddenly dropped, leaving Cole to crash against the hard reality of his own biology. He leaned back against the glass wall, sliding down slightly as his knees trembled. He coughed a wet, rattling sound and spat a small wad of blood onto the floor. "Cole," Hayes said, concern momentarily overriding his horror. "Your chest. Cracked ribs, maybe punctured a lung," Cole rasped, staring at the ceiling. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You're bleeding internally." Cole unbuttoned the ruined remains of his white undershirt. A massive purpling bruise covered the entire left side of his torso, angry and swollen. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a small, flat medical auto-injector. Standard issue for field operatives. He jammed it into his thigh and pressed the button. A cocktail of synthetic adrenaline coagulants and heavy combat painkillers flooded his system. Cole gritted his teeth as the drugs hit his brain like a freight train. The pain in his chest didn't vanish, but it receded to a dull, manageable roar. His vision sharpened. His hands stopped shaking. "It's fine," Cole repeated, pushing himself off the glass wall. He checked the action on the stolen kinetic carbine. It has to be. The transit lift slowed the artificial gravity, dampening the sudden change in momentum. The doors chimed, sliding open to reveal Deck 14. This wasn't a pristine residential or diplomatic sector. This was the belly of the beast. The walls were exposed steel, lined with massive throbbing conduits that carried coolant and raw energy from the ship's reactor core. The air was hot thick with the smell of machine oil ozone and the faint coppery tang of heated metal. The lighting was utilitarian, casting long, harsh shadows across the grating of the floor. Cole stepped out first, the kinetic carbine raised. The corridor was wide enough to drive a tank through, leading straight toward a massive, heavily fortified bulkhead. Above the bulkhead, a stenciled sign in the jagged script of the Coalition read, "Primary Containment." "There," Cole pointed. They didn't make it 10 steps before the klaxons changed pitch. The rhythmic amber pulsing switched to a furious, blinding red strobe. A localized lockdown alarm screamed through the industrial corridor. From the intersecting hallways ahead, heavy blast doors slammed down, sealing the routes. At the far end, standing in front of the reactor bulkhead, a heavy security detachment was waiting. Not regular auxiliaries this time. Heavy suppression troops. They wore thick, ablative armor designed for riot control and breach defense. They carried heavy repeater cannons weapons meant to lay down an impenetrable wall of kinetic force. There were 6 of them arranged behind portable deployable barricades. Standing behind them, holding a data pad and looking deeply inconvenienced, was a Coalition officer in a crisp gray uniform. Terran. The officer's voice echoed through a localized PA system, cutting over the alarms. "You have nowhere to go. The lift is disabled. The blast doors are sealed. Drop your weapons and submit to processing." Cole stopped. He pushed Hayes behind a thick vertical support pillar, holding up an overhead coolant pipe. "Processing," Cole yelled back, his voice raw but loud enough to carry. "Is that what you call it now?" The officer sneered, visible through the red strobe lights. "You fought well, human. Surprisingly well for a primitive. But this is the end of your violent little tantrum. You cannot outshoot 6 repeater cannons. You cannot breach that bulkhead. The mathematics of your survival are 0. Mathematics again. They always relied on the math. Cole checked the magazine of his stolen carbine. 30 rounds of tungsten. Against ablative armor and heavy barricades, it was practically useless. He couldn't snipe them, and he couldn't rush them. If he stepped out from behind the pillar, the repeater cannons would turn him into a red mist in 3 seconds flat. He looked around. He looked at the heavy throbbing conduits running along the ceiling and walls. He noticed a massive insulated pipe running directly above the barricade where the suppression troops were entrenched. The pipe was painted with thick yellow warning stripes. A pressure gauge on its side read deep in the red zone. Liquid nitrogen coolant. Super chilled. Used to keep the primary plasma feeds from melting the ship's spine. Math, Cole muttered to himself. He looked back at Hayes. "Stay right here, sir. Keep your head between your knees." "Cole, what are you doing?" Hayes hissed. "Adjusting the equation." Cole leaned out from the right side of the pillar. He didn't aim at the troops. He didn't aim at the officer. He aimed the heavy Praetorian plasma pistol at the ceiling joint, where the yellow-striped coolant pipe met a primary distribution valve directly above the enemy barricade. He pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt struck the reinforced valve housing. It didn't melt through instantly. The metal was too thick, designed to withstand intense internal pressure. But the thermal shock weakened the structural integrity. "Fire!" the coalition officer screamed, realizing what the human was targeting. The corridor erupted in deafening noise. 6 heavy repeater cannons opened up simultaneously, the air filled with flying tungsten. The concrete and steel pillar Cole was hiding behind began to disintegrate under the sheer volume of kinetic impacts. Shards of metal and rock flew like shrapnel, slicing into Cole's arms and face. Cole ignored the stinging cuts. He leaned out again, bracing his arm against the crumbling pillar, and fired a second plasma bolt into the exact same spot on the sealing valve. The metal groaned. The immense pressure inside the pipe found the weakness. With a sound like a bomb detonating, the valve shattered. Thousands of gallons of super-chilled, pressurized liquid nitrogen exploded downward in a torrential, freezing waterfall. It hit the floor and instantly vaporized into a dense, blinding white fog of sub-zero gas. The screams from the barricade were immediate and horrific. The ablative armor of the suppression troops was designed to stop bullets and dissipate heat. It was not designed for a sudden drop to -300 degrees. The flash-freezing cold seeped through the armor joints instantly. The metal of their weapons became so brittle it shattered under the tension of their own internal springs. The liquid nitrogen coated them, freezing flesh, blood, and bone in a matter of seconds. The heavy kinetic fire stopped abruptly. The corridor was plunged into an eerie silence, save for the furious hissing roar of the ruptured coolant pipe dumping its payload. A thick waist-high fog of freezing white gas rolled down the corridor toward Cole, and haze chilling the air so rapidly that frost began to form on the steel walls. Cole dropped the empty plasma pistol. It clattered loudly on the deck. He racked the bolt on his kinetic carbine and stepped out from behind the ruined pillar. He walked slowly toward the barricade, wading through the knee-deep fog of vaporized nitrogen. His boots crunched on the frozen deck plates. The 6 heavy suppression troops were statues. Frozen solid behind their barricades, their weapons shattered, their armor coated in a thick layer of white rime ice. Behind them, the coalition officer was on his knees. He hadn't been directly under the waterfall, but the ambient flash freeze had caught his legs and lower torso. His crisp gray uniform was rigid with ice. He was shivering violently, his skin turning a sickly mottled blue as profound hypothermia shut down his organs. He looked up as Cole emerged from the white fog. The human looked like a demon out of a Terran myth, battered, bleeding, exhaling plumes of white breath into the freezing air, his eyes cold and entirely empty of pity. "You," the officer chattered, his teeth clicking together. "You are monsters." "We're mechanics," Cole corrected softly, coming to a halt in front of the dying alien. "We solve problems." He raised the stock of the kinetic carbine and brought it down hard on the digital locking interface of the heavy primary containment bulkhead. The hardened plastic shattered, exposing the wiring beneath. Cole didn't need to hack it. He just needed to short it out. He jammed the bloody tip of his combat knife into the exposed circuitry. Sparks showered, and the heavy locking bolts on the reactor door disengaged with a series of loud, echoing clanks. Cole pulled his knife out, wiped it on the frozen officer's shoulder, and kicked the heavy bulkhead door open. He turned back to look down the corridor. "Ambassador," Cole called out, his breath pluming in the cold. "Let's go. We have a ship to negotiate for." The air inside the primary containment chamber didn't just feel hot, it felt heavy. It pressed against the skin, thick with the ambient radiation of a captive star and the deep bone-rattling hum of magnetic confinement fields. The chamber was a massive spherical cavern lined with lead tungsten and ablative ceramics. In the exact center, suspended over a bottomless exhaust shaft, hung the reactor core. It was a column of swirling, furious violet plasma contained within a lattice of glowing magnetic rings. It was the heart of the flagship, pumping infinite energy through the veins of the vessel. Cole walked onto the grated catwalk, extending toward the central control console. He didn't look at the core. He didn't marvel at the engineering. He looked at the thick bundles of fiber optic cables connecting the control terminal to the magnetic rings. Haze followed his hand, covering his mouth. The heat was suffocating, pulling the moisture from his lungs with every breath. He stared at the violet pillar of fire. "If that containment field drops, the plasma expands," Cole finished, his voice tight. "It burns through the ship's spine in 4 seconds. The ammunition magazines cook off in 6. In 10 seconds, this dreadnought is a very expensive, very brief supernova, and it takes half the fleet anchored outside with it." He reached the control console. It was a semicircular bank of holographic interfaces and heavy physical overrides. Cole slumped against it, his breathing shallow. The stims were holding the pain at bay, but his body was cashing checks it couldn't cover. His left hand was trembling violently. He ignored it. He brought up the heavy kinetic carbine and smashed the reinforced glass covering the manual safety interlocks. He didn't know how to read the Coalition's language, but engineering was a universal constant. Red meant danger. Heavy physical switches meant hardline control. He gripped a thick, ratcheted lever that controlled the primary coolant flow to the upper magnetic ring. He pulled it down 1 notch. A loud mechanical klaxon blared through the chamber. The violet plasma in the center of the room flared violently, the containment ring straining as a spike of heat pushed against the invisible barrier. A holographic projector above the console snapped to life. Princess Chloe's face materialized in the air. She was no longer lounging on a polymer throne. She was standing in the ship's command center, surrounded by panicked technicians. Her elegant silks were rumpled. Her face, previously a mask of bored amusement, was tight with absolute unadulterated terror. "Stop!" her voice echoed through the chamber, stripped of all its musical condescension. "Terran, take your hand off that lever." Cole looked up at the hologram. He didn't let go of the lever. He leaned his weight against it. "Princess," Cole rasped. He wiped a mixture of sweat and alien blood from his brow. "Your execution didn't take." "You are insane," Chloe whispered, her holographic eyes darting to the violent swirling of the core behind him. "If you breach containment, you die with us. Your ambassador dies with you. It is suicide." "It's math," Cole said. His voice was dead devoid of bluff or bravado. "You like math, right? 12 Praetorians, 6 suppression troops, a fortified bulkhead. You calculated we couldn't make it here. You were wrong. Now calculate this. I have nothing left to lose. My ribs are in pieces. I'm bleeding internally. I'm going to die anyway. The only variable left is how many of you come with me." Chloe stared at him. She looked at the blood soaking his torn charcoal suit, the bruising on his face, the absolute chilling void in his eyes. He wasn't negotiating. He was stating a physical law of the universe. "What do you want?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. "A clear path," Cole said. "Hangar 4. You are going to power down the automated defenses. You are going to pull your garrison back to their barracks. You are going to prep our diplomatic shuttle for immediate launch, and you are going to clear a hyperspace lane." "And if I do," she countered, trying to find a shred of leverage. "How do I know you won't pull that lever anyway?" "Because he is a Terran," Ambassador Hayes spoke up. Cole glanced back. The older man had stepped out from the shadows of the catwalk. He was still pale, still trembling slightly, but he had straightened his back. He stepped up beside Cole, looking directly into the holographic projection of the princess. "Our word is our bond, Princess," Hayes said, finding his diplomatic voice, though it carried a new, hardened edge. "You broke the rules of engagement. You violated the sanctity of peace. But we are not you. Give us our ship, and we will leave." Chloe's jaw tightened. "You ask me to humiliate myself, to let a single baseline human and a bureaucrat walk off my flagship after slaughtering my personal guard. The political fallout will be a lot worse if this ship is radioactive dust," Cole interrupted. He shifted his grip on the lever. He pulled it down another notch. The ship groaned. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the fillings in their teeth. The violet plasma surged, licking aggressively against the failing magnetic constraints. Searing heat washed over the catwalk, singeing the edges of Cole's ruined suit. In the hologram, the command center behind Chloe descended into chaos as alarms screamed and sparks showered from overloaded terminals. "Wait!" Chloe shrieked, throwing her hands up. The regal facade shattered entirely. "Wait, stop!" Cole held the lever steady. He didn't push it back up. He waited. "Done!" Chloe gasped, her chest heaving. "The path is clear. The shuttle is prepped. The hangar is empty. Just restore the coolant flow." "Not yet," Cole said. He turned to Hayes. "Sir, you know how to use an open-frequency distress beacon." Hayes frowned. "Of course, but—" "Do it," Cole ordered. "Tap into the console, override their comms lock, broadcast to every ship in the sector, Coalition Terran Independent Pirate, everyone. Cole, she gave us what we want. If we push her, if we leave quietly, she spins the story," Cole said. He looked back at the terrified face of the princess. She says we went rogue. She says we murdered her guards unprovoked. She uses it as a casus belli to glass Earth. We don't just need to survive, Ambassador. We need to win. The heat of the core was blistering. Cole felt his skin drying, tightening over his face. The stim cocktail in his system was beginning to sour, leaving behind a cold metallic taste in his mouth and a creeping numbness in his extremities. He kept his hand clamped on the manual release lever. His knuckles were white. Beside him, Hayes was working furiously at the alien console. He didn't know the exact syntax of the Coalition's operating system, but broadcast protocols were generally standardized across the sector. Frequencies were frequencies. "I have it," Hayes muttered, wiping sweat from his eyes. "I'm routing the feed through the Dreadnought's primary communication array. It's an unencrypted wideband pulse. Anyone within 10 light-years with a receiver is going to hear this." "Do it," Cole said. Hayes pressed a sequence of physical keys. The command console flashed a brilliant affirmative green. "We are live," Hayes said. He took a deep breath, looking at the blinking recording light. He smoothed the lapels of his torn jacket. He was a diplomat again. "This is Ambassador Thomas Hayes of the Terran Systems Alliance." He spoke into the console, his voice steady, carrying the weight of 1,000,000,000 lives. "Broadcasting from the primary reactor control of the Coalition flagship Ascendant. 20 minutes ago, under the guise of formal peace negotiations, Princess Chloe of the Sovereign Coalition attempted to execute the Terran delegation." In the hologram, Chloe covered her face with her hands. It was over. The lie was dead. The attempt failed. Hayes continued. "The Coalition's elite Praetorian Guard has been neutralized. Their heavy suppression forces have been bypassed. We currently hold the flagship's reactor core at our discretion. Let this serve as a formal declaration to the galaxy. The Terran Alliance desires peace. We build outposts, we trade, we explore. But if you invite us into your home under the banner of truce and draw a blade," Hayes looked at Cole. He looked at the blood, the shattered armor, the cold mechanical determination of the man holding the ship's life in his hands. "We will burn your house down from the inside," Hayes finished. "End transmission." He killed the feed. The silence in the reactor room felt deafening after the broadcast. Cole looked at the hologram of the princess. She was staring at the deck of her command center, defeated. The invincible aura of the Coalition had just been broadcast as a sham to the entire sector. A single human had carved through their finest warriors and held their capital ship hostage. "Restore the coolant," Chloe whispered, her voice hollow. "Your point is made. The hangar is yours. Go." Cole pushed the heavy ratcheted lever upward, locking it back into its original position. The klaxons in the reactor room immediately silenced. The violet plasma in the core stabilized the aggressive flaring, subsiding into a steady, furious spin. The oppressive heat dropped by a fraction of a degree. Cole let go of the lever. The moment his hand left the metal, his knees buckled. He caught himself against the edge of the console, his breath escaping in a sharp, ragged hiss. The adrenaline crash hit him with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted dangerously to the left. The edges of his vision filled with static. "Cole." Hayes grabbed his shoulder, hauling him upright. "I'm good," Cole gritted out. He wasn't. His cracked ribs felt like hot knives grinding against his lungs with every breath. He drew his stolen kinetic carbine, using it like a crutch to stand straight. "We have a long walk." They left the control console. They walked back across the graded catwalk, leaving the humming furious star behind them. Cole didn't look back. The journey from the sweltering radiation-baked hell of Deck 14 to the pristine staging grounds of Hangar 4 took exactly 22 minutes. For Ambassador Hayes, it felt like a geological epic. They didn't sneak through the maintenance tunnels. They didn't stick to the shadows. Cole led them straight down the center of the Dreadnought's primary concourse. The heavy blast doors that had previously threatened to entomb them now slid open obediently at their approach, the automated turrets in the vaulted ceilings pivoting upward, locking themselves into neutral unpowered housing. And the soldiers were waiting. They lined the corridors by the thousands, rows upon rows of coalition auxiliaries standing perfectly rigid against the polished obsidian bulkheads. They wore their dress-gray carapace armor, their kinetic rifles slung tightly across their chests, their four-fingered hands resting flat against their thighs. They had been ordered by the princess herself to stand down, to form an honor guard for the butchers of their elite. They watched in absolute terrifying silence as the two Terrans walked by. Hayes tried to keep his chin elevated, desperately, attempting to project an aura of diplomatic invulnerability. He smoothed the ruined ash-stained lapels of his jacket, trying to ignore the way his knees trembled with every step. He felt like a mouse forced to march through a canyon of starving wolves. He could hear the faint ambient clicking of alien mandibles, the subtle hum of armor servos twitching in agitation. The air smelled of sterile ship scrubbers, heavy ozone, and the distinct, acrid pheromones of alien fear. It would only take one rogue soldier, one fanatic who decided the princess's orders were cowardice, one twitch of a trigger finger, and the corridor would become a slaughterhouse. But not a single weapon was raised. They weren't looking at the ambassador. They were looking at the man walking half a pace ahead of him. Cole was falling apart. The synthetic adrenaline cocktail he had injected was beginning to metabolize into a toxic, heavy sludge in his veins, leaving behind nothing but a profound cellular exhaustion. He dragged his left leg slightly the boot, scuffing against the polished deck plates in a slow, agonizing rhythm. His tailored charcoal suit was entirely unrecognizable, stiff and heavy with dried violet blood, scored by black plasma burns and torn to ragged strips. His face was a horrifying canvas of swelling purple flesh and deep lacerations, his skin pale as chalk beneath the grime. He held the heavy stolen kinetic carbine in his right hand. He didn't aim it. He didn't sweep the crowd of thousands of armed soldiers. He used it like a walking stick, resting his weight on the barrel with every limping step. To the alien soldiers, he didn't look like a legendary warrior. He looked like a corpse that had simply forgotten to stop moving. They had seen the security feeds. They had seen the aftermath in the transit corridors and the audience hall. They had seen the flash-frozen suppression team. They knew exactly what this battered, bleeding creature was capable of. The silence in the concourse wasn't born of military discipline. It was born of a primal, instinctual terror. They were apex predators, a species that had conquered a dozen star systems, and they had just realized there was a much bigger, much older monster in the dark. The corridor finally opened up the ceiling, rising away to reveal the staggering cavernous expanse of Hangar 4. The massive outer bay doors were retracted, leaving the hangar open to the brutal void of space, held back only by the faint shimmering blue honeycomb of an atmospheric retention field. Beyond that delicate barrier of light the black canvas of the cosmos stretched out dotted with the cold, distant light of foreign stars and the heavy, menacing silhouettes of the coalition blockade fleet. Sitting dead center in the vast, empty landing zone was their diplomatic shuttle, a sleek silver wedge of Terran engineering. It was completely unarmed, lacking even basic point defense cannons, built purely for speed and diplomatic comfort. Compared to the armored gunships resting in the surrounding bays, it looked like a fragile tin toy. Yet to Hayes, its sublight engines glowing a dull, warm blue in the dim hangar light, made it the most beautiful thing in the universe. The boarding ramp was lowered, kissing the polished deck. Cole stopped at the base of the ramp. The sudden cessation of forward momentum seemed to confuse his failing body. He swayed dangerously, his boots scraping the floor as he fought to keep his balance. He leaned heavily on the kinetic carbine. He didn't look at the shuttle. He turned slowly, his boots grinding against the deck, and looked back the way they had come. A dozen high-ranking coalition officers stood at the threshold of the hangar concourse. They were clad in their finest ceremonial silks, their faces tight with repressed fury and deep, humiliating shame. High above them, nestled into the bulkhead, was the hangar control booth. Through the thick tinted glass, Cole could just make out the silhouette of Princess Chloe. She was standing close to the glass, looking down at him. Cole didn't offer a mocking salute. He didn't shout a final, triumphant threat to the silent thousands watching him. The time for theatrics was over. He carefully shifted his weight, wincing as a sharp, agonizing spasm racked his cracked ribs and reached down to his right boot. His hand found the familiar sweat-stained leather of the sheath. He pulled the 6-inch combat knife free. The matte black finish was entirely gone. The blade was heavily chipped along the edge, stained a dark rusty violet, and completely dull. It looked exactly like what it was, a cheap piece of stamped steel from Ohio that had been pushed far beyond its operational limits. Cole held it up. He let the harsh artificial light of the hangar catch the ruined steel. He looked at the officers. He looked up at the silhouette behind the glass. Then he opened his hand. The knife fell. It hit the polished hangar deck with a sharp echoing clatter that rang out through the dead silence of the massive room. It bounced once, then slid to a halt, just inches from the boots of the nearest coalition officer. A piece of sharpened metal. A dining utensil. Cole didn't wait to see their reaction. He turned his back on the assembled might of the sovereign coalition and limped up the boarding ramp. Hayes practically sprinted after him, his dress shoes clacking wildly on the metal grating. The moment they crossed the threshold into the shuttle, the air changed. It smelled heavily of recycled oxygen ozone and cheap pine antiseptic. It smelled exactly like humanity. Hayes didn't hesitate. He slapped the heavy emergency closure panel on the bulkhead. The ramp whined, retracting swiftly into the hull, and the heavy airlock door slammed shut, engaging its magnetic seals with a heavy, reassuring thud. "I'm taking the helm!" Hayes shouted, his voice cracking with the sudden release of tension. He scrambled up the short ladder to the cockpit, dropping into the pilot's seat. He grabbed the flight yoke, his hands flying across the tactile displays. "Clearance codes are locking." Hayes narrated mostly to himself, desperate to fill the silence. "Docking clamps are fully disengaged. They really cleared a lane. I have a direct vector through their blockade line. Spooling the hyperdrive now." The shuttle shuddered. The repulsor lifts whined in protest as Hayes pushed the throttle forward. The small ship lifted off the alien deck, pivoting smoothly and glided right through the shimmering atmospheric retention field. The sudden silence of the vacuum swallowed them. The massive, terrifying bulk of the coalition dreadnought fell away beneath them, a floating city of white armor and bristling dormant weapons. In the passenger cabin below, Cole finally let go of the rope. He dropped the heavy kinetic carbine. It clattered loudly against the floor plates. He stumbled blindly toward the nearest reinforced crash couch, missing it entirely on the first try. He caught himself on the armrest, his arm trembling violently, and practically fell into the seat. The last dregs of his adrenaline finally burned out completely. The void it left behind was instantly filled with a crushing, blinding agony. The world tilted sideways. His vision narrowed to a tiny static-filled pinprick. Every single breath sounded like wet paper tearing in his chest. Up in the cockpit, Hayes locked the autopilot onto a direct trajectory for Terran space, pushing the sublight engines to their absolute maximum yield. Once they cleared the dreadnought's mass shadow, he unbuckled his harness and hurried down the ladder to the passenger cabin. He found Cole slouched sideways in the couch. The bodyguard's eyes were closed, his head resting awkwardly against the bulkhead. His chest was barely moving. Cole? Hayes dropped to his knees, ripping open the emergency medical kit secured under the seat. He fumbled with the clasps, his hands shaking so badly he dropped a sterile wrap on the floor. He pulled out the diagnostic scanner and ran it over Cole's ruined chest. The small screen immediately flashed a brilliant, angry red. God. Hayes breathed, reading the scrolling text. 2 fully fractured ribs, one shattered in 3 places, severe internal hemorrhaging, micro tears in the pulmonary lining. You're drowning in your own blood. Hayes ripped a heavy trauma patch from its foil casing. He didn't bother trying to unbutton Cole's shirt. He grabbed the torn fabric and ripped it completely open, exposing the massive purpling swelling that covered the entire left side of Cole's torso. He slapped the thick adhesive bandage directly over the worst of the bruising, pressing the activation stud. A sharp hiss followed as the patch drove a dozen micro-needles into Cole's skin, flooding his system with medical-grade coagulants, tissue sealants, and the heaviest painkillers legally allowed on a Terran vessel. Cole didn't flinch. He didn't even groan. He just cracked his left eye open, staring blankly at the ceiling of the shuttle. "Did we jump yet?" Cole whispered. His voice was a wet, scraping rasp that sounded like it was being dragged over gravel. 30 seconds, Hayes said frantically, adjusting the flow rate settings on the trauma patch, desperate to stop the internal bleeding. "You have to stay awake, Cole. The patch is stabilizing your lungs, but it's a temporary fix. You need a proper surgical suite and a trauma team. Stay with me." "I'm awake," Cole muttered. The heavy painkillers were finally taking the edge off the sharpest knives in his chest, replacing the agony with a heavy, numb, floating sensation. He turned his head a fraction of an inch, looking out the reinforced viewport beside his seat. Outside, the distant pinpricks of stars began to stretch. The deep absolute black of the void warped, pulling into long, brilliant streaks of shifting white and blue light. The low structural hum of the hyperdrive vibrated through the hull, a comforting, steady mechanical heartbeat. "We jumped!" Hayes breathed a massive sigh of relief, escaping him as he slumped back onto his heels. He wiped a hand across his sweating forehead. "We're out. We actually got out." Cole let his eyes slide shut again. The tension finally bled completely out of his muscles. The cold mechanical predator retreated to the darkest corners of his mind, leaving behind nothing but a broken, profoundly tired man who just wanted to sleep for a week. "Ambassador," Cole said softly into the hum of the engine. "Yes, Cole, I'm right here. Next time we get invited to a peace summit—" Cole paused, swallowing past the dry, metallic taste of blood in his throat. "I'm bringing a bigger knife." Hayes stared at the battered man for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the blood on his own hands. He thought about the 12 dead Praetorians, the flash-frozen suppression team, and the absolute terror in the eyes of a princess who thought she owned the stars. Slowly, an unfamiliar sound bubbled up in the ambassador's chest. It was sharp, hysterical, and entirely devoid of his usual careful diplomatic grace. Hayes started to laugh. He sat on the floor of the vibrating shuttle, surrounded by torn medical wrappers and the stench of violence, and laughed until heavy, stinging tears streamed down his face. Cole couldn't laugh. His ribs wouldn't allow it. But as the small Terran shuttle tore through the fabric of hyperspace, leaving the invincible sovereign coalition and their perfect mathematics millions of miles behind the corners of his bruised mouth, twitched upward into a small, bloody smile. They had brought a butter knife to a laser fight, and they had won. Humanity didn't need to be gods. They didn't need to pretend they were above the dirt and the blood. They just needed to be the hardest, most stubborn things in the room. And as long as they had iron and oxygen and the sheer, spiteful refusal to die quietly, the rest of the galaxy was just going to have to learn to step aside. Cole let the darkness finally pull him under the steady rhythmic hum of the Terran engine, singing him to sleep. If you enjoyed this deep dive into human resilience, drop a like to let the algorithm know. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another HFY sci-fi story. We upload new tales of humanity's grit, ingenuity, and sheer refusal to die every single week. What did you think of Cole's final message to the Coalition? Leave a comment down below with your favorite moment. Your support helps the channel grow and brings more epic tales to life. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. And as always, keep looking up at the stars. See you in the next one.